What if I told you that while the world has been fixated on Dubai's gleaming towers and Singapore's futuristic skylines, a small Caribbean island has quietly become the testing ground for the most ambitious urban experiment of the 21st century, a project so massive, so strategically positioned, that it could fundamentally reshape global trade routes and challenge everything we think we know about economic superpowers. This isn't just another real estate development. This is the story of how Jamaica became China's secret weapon in a trillion-dollar chess game that spans 3 continents, involves more money than most countries' entire GDP, and could determine which nation controls the economic future of the Americas. But before we dive into what's happening right now in a place called Mami Bay, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why China would invest over $730 million in a highway on an island most people can only find on a map after careful searching? The answer isn't tourism, it isn't charity, and it definitely isn't coincidence. The year is 2013. While Western economies are still recovering from the global financial crisis, China launches the most audacious infrastructure program in human history. The Belt and Road Initiative, $1 trillion, 68 countries, a modern-day Silk Road designed to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through ports, railways, highways, and digital networks. But here's what most people missed. The Caribbean wasn't an afterthought. It was always part of the plan. You see, China understood something that traditional powers overlooked. Geography is destiny. And Jamaica sits at one of the most strategically valuable positions on Earth. It's the gateway between North and South America. It's the crossroads of major shipping lanes carrying over 40% of the world's containerized cargo. And it's exactly 14 hours by sea from the Panama Canal, the choke point that controls global maritime trade. When China Harbor Engineering Company, known as CHEC, arrived in Jamaica, they didn't come as tourists. They came as architects of a new world order. The North-South Highway was just the beginning, a $730 million proof of concept that would transform Jamaica's infrastructure and, more importantly, demonstrate China's ability to deliver on impossible timelines. What once took 3.5 hours to cross the island now takes barely 90 minutes. Communities that were isolated for generations suddenly found themselves connected to global markets. But every revolution has its cost. That highway came with strings attached. $730 million in debt to Chinese banks. Toll rates that many Jamaicans simply cannot afford. A new reality where the fastest route across their own island requires paying foreign creditors. This is the pattern playing out across the developing world. According to the Center for Economics and Business Research, China's Belt and Road Initiative is projected to increase global GDP by over $7 trillion annually by 2040. But that growth comes with a price tag that many countries are only beginning to understand. And Jamaica became the 10th Caribbean nation to formally join the Belt and Road Initiative. Not because they had a choice, but because they had already seen what Chinese investment could accomplish. The question wasn't whether to join. The question was what China would build next. The answer lies in a pristine stretch of coastline in St. Ann Parish, where 740 acres of untouched Caribbean paradise are about to become something that has never existed before in this region. Not a resort, not a port, but an entire city, planned and funded by Chinese capital, designed to house thousands of people, and positioned to serve as a model for development projects across Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome to Mami Bay, China's Caribbean laboratory. Now, let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening here, because the scope of this project defies easy categorization. When we say residential development, we're not talking about a subdivision. We're talking about urban planning on a scale that rivals Singapore's early development or Dubai's Palm Jumeirah project. 6 phases, 5.5 years. Thousands of housing units ranging from luxury townhouses to affordable apartment complexes. Schools, hospitals, shopping centers, recreational facilities, transportation hubs. This isn't just housing. This is nation building at the municipal level. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. The same company building Mami Bay, China Harbor Engineering Company, isn't just a construction firm. It's a subsidiary of China Communications Construction Company, one of the largest infrastructure companies in the world. CCCC has built ports in Pakistan, railways in Africa, and bridges across Southeast Asia. Their projects collectively represent over $200 billion in international infrastructure investment. So when CHEC decides to build a city in Jamaica, they're not thinking like developers. They're thinking like geopolitical strategists. Consider the location. Mami Bay sits on Jamaica's northern coast, less than 30 minutes from Ocho Rios, home to one of the Caribbean's busiest cruise ports. It's within driving distance of Ian Fleming International Airport, recently expanded to accommodate larger aircraft. It's connected by the North-South Highway, also built by CHEC, to Kingston's shipping facilities and Norman Manley International Airport. This isn't coincidence. This is strategic positioning for what military analysts call dual-use infrastructure. Projects that serve civilian purposes but can be rapidly converted to support military or economic objectives. Now, before you dismiss this as conspiracy theory, let me share some numbers that should make you pause. China has invested over $679 billion in international infrastructure projects since 2008. Upper-middle-income countries, exactly like Jamaica, have received 33% of that investment, approximately $223 billion. But here's the crucial detail that most analyses miss. These aren't loans. These aren't gifts. These are strategic investments designed to create long-term dependencies and spheres of influence. The model is elegant in its simplicity. China identifies countries with strategic value but limited capital. They offer to build infrastructure that these countries desperately need but cannot afford. The projects create jobs, improve connectivity, and generate immediate economic benefits. But they also create debt obligations, operational dependencies, and ultimately, political leverage. Sri Lanka learned this lesson the hard way when they couldn't repay Chinese loans for Hambantota Port. The solution: a 99-year lease transferring operational control to Chinese companies. Effectively, China now operates a major port facility on Sri Lankan soil, positioned perfectly to monitor and influence shipping traffic between Asia and the Middle East. Pakistan discovered similar realities with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $67 billion project that has transformed infrastructure, but also created debt obligations equivalent to nearly 30% of Pakistan's total GDP. And now Jamaica, with its strategic Caribbean position, is becoming the next case study in this model of economic diplomacy. But let's zoom back to Mami Bay, because what's happening there represents something new, something that goes beyond traditional infrastructure debt. Unlike ports or highways, residential developments create permanent populations, people with jobs, families, communities, and political interests. When you build a city, you're not just creating infrastructure, you're creating constituencies. Imagine 10,000 residents living in a Chinese-planned, Chinese-built, Chinese-financed community. Their children attend schools built with Chinese education models. Their local businesses operate in commercial spaces designed around Chinese retail concepts. Their municipal services rely on Chinese technology and Chinese maintenance contracts. This isn't cultural imperialism. This is something more subtle and potentially more powerful. This is the creation of economic ecosystems that naturally align with Chinese interests and Chinese approaches to development. The environmental implications alone should give us pause. Jamaica's coastal ecosystems are among the most biodiverse in the Caribbean. The coral reefs surrounding the northern coast support over 60% of the island's marine fisheries. The watersheds feeding into these coastal areas provide fresh water for nearly 40% of Jamaica's population. Studies of similar coastal developments across the Caribbean show consistent patterns. Initial environmental impact assessments often underestimate long-term ecological damage. Storm water runoff from large residential developments can destroy coral reef systems within a decade. Increased coastal development accelerates erosion and increases vulnerability to hurricanes and sea level rise. But here's where the Mami Bay project becomes truly complex. CHEC claims they're implementing advanced environmental protection measures, buffer zones around sensitive areas, gray water recycling systems, storm water management infrastructure, renewable energy integration. If they deliver on these promises, Mami Bay could become a model for sustainable tropical development. If they don't, it could become an environmental disaster that poisons Jamaica's northern coast for generations. The challenge is that environmental protection is expensive, time-consuming, and often conflicts with construction timelines and profit margins. Chinese infrastructure projects have a mixed track record on environmental compliance, particularly in developing countries where regulatory oversight may be limited. So the question becomes, is this project genuinely committed to environmental sustainability, or are these promises simply marketing designed to overcome local opposition? The economic implications extend far beyond Jamaica's borders. China's Caribbean investments are part of a broader strategy to establish alternative trade routes and reduce dependence on U.S.-controlled choke points. The Panama Canal, controlled by Panama but heavily influenced by American foreign policy. The Strait of Hormuz, where U.S. naval forces maintain a permanent presence. The Strait of Malacca, where American allies control key positions. By developing ports, airports, and logistical hubs across the Caribbean, China is creating what military strategists call alternative pathways. Routes that could maintain Chinese trade flows even if traditional shipping lanes become contested or unavailable. Mami Bay fits perfectly into this strategy. A large residential development creates the population base needed to support expanded port facilities. Expanded port facilities create the economic justification for deeper harbors and larger ships. Larger ships enable more direct trade between China and Latin America, bypassing traditional American-controlled transit points. The numbers support this analysis. China-Caribbean trade has increased by over 400% since 2005. Chinese construction companies now operate in every Caribbean nation except two. Chinese banks hold debt obligations from Caribbean governments totaling over $15 billion. But this isn't just about economics. This is about reshaping the geopolitical balance of the Western Hemisphere. For over 2 centuries, the Caribbean has been considered an American sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, explicitly warned European powers against establishing new colonies or dependencies in the Americas. But what happens when the challenge doesn't come from Europe and doesn't take the form of traditional colonization? China's Caribbean strategy is sophisticated precisely because it avoids direct confrontation with American interests. Chinese companies build infrastructure that Caribbean nations genuinely need. Chinese banks provide financing that Western institutions often won't offer. Chinese trade relationships create markets for Caribbean products that might otherwise have limited export opportunities. From a Caribbean perspective, this isn't about choosing sides in a great power competition. This is about accessing capital and expertise needed for development that has been delayed for decades. But from an American strategic perspective, this represents a fundamental challenge to regional influence. Every Chinese port can potentially support Chinese naval vessels. Every Chinese-built airport can handle Chinese military aircraft. Every Chinese debt obligation creates leverage that could be used to limit American access or influence. The Biden administration has recognized this challenge. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, launched in 2021, represents an attempt to provide alternatives to Chinese Belt and Road projects, but with initial commitments of only $6 million, compared to China's annual infrastructure spending of over $50 billion. The scale of response doesn't match the scale of challenge. And this brings us back to Mami Bay, because what happens there could determine the template for Chinese development projects across Latin America and the Caribbean. If Mami Bay succeeds, if it creates jobs, improves living standards, protects the environment, and generates sustainable economic growth, it becomes a model that other Caribbean nations will want to replicate. Chinese companies will have proven they can deliver not just infrastructure, but entire communities that improve quality of life for local populations. If Mami Bay fails, if it creates environmental damage, displaces local communities, generates unsustainable debt, or becomes a source of social tension, it could discredit Chinese development models and create political space for alternative approaches. But here's what makes this story so compelling. We won't have to wait decades to see the results. Construction is already underway. The first phase is scheduled for completion within 18 months. Environmental impact assessments are being conducted in real time. Community consultations are ongoing. Economic data is being generated monthly. This means that by 2026, we'll have concrete evidence of whether Chinese-led urban development can deliver on its promises in the Caribbean context. And that evidence will influence development decisions across the developing world. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are watching Jamaica closely. If Mami Bay proves that Chinese companies can build sustainable, community-centered urban developments, it will unlock similar projects worth hundreds of billions of dollars across the global south. If Mami Bay demonstrates that these projects create more problems than solutions, it could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Belt and Road Initiative. So let's examine what we know about the current state of the project. Environmental assessments are being conducted by international consultancies, not just Chinese firms. This suggests a genuine commitment to credible oversight, but also creates accountability that could become politically sensitive if problems are discovered. Community consultations have generated mixed responses. Supporters emphasize job creation, infrastructure improvements, and increased property values. Critics raise concerns about displacement, cultural change, and loss of local control over development decisions. Government officials maintain that all projects comply with Jamaican environmental and planning regulations. But regulatory oversight in developing countries often lacks the resources needed for comprehensive monitoring of projects this complex. International observers note that Jamaica's experience with Chinese infrastructure has been generally positive. The North-South Highway was completed on schedule, within budget, and has delivered measurable economic benefits. But highways are simpler than cities. Roads don't have populations. Bridges don't have ecosystems. Financial transparency remains limited. While the overall project cost has been disclosed, detailed financing arrangements, debt obligations, and revenue-sharing agreements have not been made public. This lack of transparency makes it difficult to assess long-term financial implications for Jamaica, or to understand what obligations might be created if the project encounters financial difficulties. The construction timeline is ambitious but not unrealistic. Chinese construction companies have demonstrated ability to complete large-scale projects rapidly, but they have also encountered significant delays when environmental or community opposition emerges unexpectedly. Local hiring practices appear to follow Chinese standard procedures, which typically involve a mix of Chinese technical staff and local labor. This creates job opportunities, but may also create tensions if local workers feel excluded from higher-paying technical positions. The broader regional implications are already becoming apparent. Other Caribbean nations are initiating discussions about similar projects. Barbados has announced plans for a Chinese-financed industrial park. Trinidad and Tobago is exploring Chinese investment in port expansion. The Dominican Republic is negotiating Chinese financing for airport improvements. This suggests that regardless of what happens at Mami Bay specifically, the model of Chinese-led urban development is gaining momentum across the Caribbean. American policymakers are taking notice. Congressional hearings have examined Chinese infrastructure investments in the Caribbean. Military analysts have assessed potential security implications. Development economists have studied the long-term impacts of Chinese financing models. But American responses have been primarily reactive. Warnings about debt sustainability, concerns about strategic implications, criticism of environmental standards, very little proactive offering of alternative financing or development partnerships. This reactive approach may explain why Chinese infrastructure investment continues to expand across the Caribbean despite American concerns. From a Caribbean perspective, criticism without alternatives is not particularly helpful. These countries need infrastructure, capital, and development partnerships. If American or European institutions are not prepared to provide these resources on competitive terms, Chinese offers become attractive by default. And this is where the Mami Bay project becomes a test case for more than just urban development. It becomes a test of whether Western powers can offer credible alternatives to Chinese-led development models. If Mami Bay succeeds, and if Western institutions continue to offer primarily criticism rather than competing proposals, it could accelerate Chinese infrastructure investment across Latin America and the Caribbean. If Mami Bay encounters significant problems, and if Western institutions are prepared to offer alternative development partnerships, it could create opportunities for more diversified international engagement in Caribbean development. The environmental dimension adds another layer of complexity. Climate change is already affecting Caribbean ecosystems. Sea level rise, increased storm intensity, changing precipitation patterns, rising temperatures. These changes make sustainable development more challenging, but also more essential. Coastal developments like Mami Bay are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. Hurricane damage, flooding, erosion, coral reef degradation, freshwater contamination. These risks require sophisticated engineering solutions and long-term environmental management. Chinese companies have mixed records on climate-resilient infrastructure. Some projects incorporate advanced adaptation measures. Others have proven vulnerable to extreme weather events. The Mami Bay project claims to incorporate climate resilience into design and construction. Advanced storm water management, elevated construction, renewable energy systems, natural buffer zones. But climate resilience is expensive, and market pressures often encourage cost-cutting that compromises long-term sustainability. Independent environmental monitoring will be essential to verify whether these promises are actually implemented during construction and operation. The social dimensions may prove most complex of all. Large-scale development projects inevitably change existing communities. Property values rise, which benefits existing landowners but can price out renters and service workers. New businesses arrive, creating opportunities but also competition for existing enterprises. Population growth increases demand for services, which can strain existing infrastructure or create new markets. Managing these transitions successfully requires extensive community engagement, transparent decision-making, and adaptive management approaches that respond to unexpected challenges. Chinese companies have demonstrated technical expertise in construction and engineering. Their record on community engagement and social impact management is less consistent. Cultural differences, language barriers, and different approaches to public consultation can create misunderstandings that escalate into conflicts. The Mami Bay project will test whether Chinese development companies can successfully navigate these social complexities in the Caribbean context. Success requires more than delivering physical infrastructure on time and budget. It requires building community support, managing social transitions, and creating economic opportunities that benefit existing residents as well as new arrivals. This is particularly important because residential developments create permanent changes that can't be easily reversed if problems emerge. Highway projects can be rerouted. Port facilities can be relocated. But once you've built a city, the social and environmental impacts become permanent features of the landscape. So as we watch the Mami Bay project unfold over the next 5 years, we're essentially watching a real-time experiment in whether Chinese-led development can successfully address the complex challenges of sustainable urban growth in small island developing states. The results will influence development policies across the global south. They will shape great power competition in the Caribbean, and they will determine whether the Belt and Road Initiative represents a genuinely sustainable development model or simply a more sophisticated form of economic dependency. The stakes could not be higher. For Jamaica, this project represents the largest single private investment in the country's history. Success could transform the island's development trajectory and establish it as a model for sustainable Caribbean urbanization. Failure could create environmental damage, social disruption, and financial obligations that burden future generations. For China, this project represents a test of whether the Belt and Road Initiative can deliver on its promises of mutual benefit and sustainable development. Success validates the model for expansion across Latin America. Failure provides ammunition for critics and competitors. For the United States and other Western powers, this project represents a test of their ability to offer credible alternatives to Chinese development finance. Success of Chinese-led projects without competitive Western alternatives could accelerate the shift of global South countries toward Chinese economic partnerships. For the international development community, this project represents a test of whether large-scale private infrastructure investment can contribute to sustainable development goals, or whether it inevitably prioritizes profit over people and environment. And for the rest of the world, this project represents a preview of the development models that may shape the global economy for the next several decades. The era of Western-dominated development finance is clearly ending. China has demonstrated the resources and capability to become the world's leading infrastructure investor. The question is not whether Chinese companies will continue building major projects across the developing world. The question is whether they will build them in ways that genuinely contribute to sustainable development. Mami Bay is where we'll find out.